Okay, good morning. My name is Natasha Neal. I'm a professor in the political science department, and Professor Wright has asked me to review chapter 3 for you today, which is on political culture and political socialization. So, just to get you started, if you look at this chapter, what this chapter does is that it examines political culture and it examines political socialization from that of the African American. So, most of you may know about political socialization and political culture from other classes. And those classes talked about generalizations that pretty much apply to everyone. But here we're going to specifically talk about the subculture. How are African Americans socialized to believe what they believe about politics and government? What are their values? Where do they get those from? What are their opinions? So we're going to talk about that in that sense. But first, before we get started, what I want to do is let's take a look at your textbook. In your textbook, according to your textbook, the definition provided is that political culture refers to attitudes, values, and beliefs about politics and the political system. So, we're going to look at again what are the attitudes, the values about politics in reference to African Americans. Where do we get those from? As opposed to the generalizations that we typically make, which is often truly based upon what Caucasian Americans think, which make up the majority of the population. So when we look at political culture, let's do that different. Let's go over that definition one more time. It refers to attitudes, values, and beliefs about politics and the political system. So we're going to look at the attitudes, the values, and beliefs of African Americans in terms of the political system here in the United States. And hopefully you will understand that African Americans view the political system different. And we'll talk about some things that are going on now in society that's taking place, and that will help you maybe understand why Black Lives Matter, for example, for African Americans. Now, your textbook goes on to define political socialization as an ongoing process by which individuals acquire their attitudes, values, and beliefs. So think about this. That means that we are going to examine what influences the political socialization process of African Americans. But let's go over that definition one more time. It is an ongoing process. And when we say ongoing, that means that it continues throughout your life. What you believe at age 9, what you believe at age 12, what you believe at age 18, 35, 46, 90, all of that will change over time. And that's why it's considered a process. But again, in order to understand political socialization, we have to understand political culture. So we have to understand what is the Black culture, and then we can talk about what is the socialization process for African Americans. Okay, let's look at your textbook again. According to your textbook, agents of political socialization are the mechanisms by which individuals acquire their attitudes, beliefs, and values. Okay, one more time, let's go over the definition. Agents of political socialization are mechanisms, factors, elements by which an individual acquires their attitudes, their beliefs, and their values. So, we have political culture, which what's the culture in the Black community. Then we have the socialization process. how we believe what we believe, how we acquire those ideas and beliefs, and that's done through the agents of political socialization. Now, let's take a little closer look. We've got some basic definitions of what political culture is. We have basic definition of political socialization, and we know how we are socialized over a period of time through what is referred to as agents of political socialization. So let's talk about political culture. Now, when we talk about political culture, we're taking a closer look at political culture in terms of the African American community. But we have to keep in mind that there are some basic beliefs that are held by all Americans, regardless of race, gender, and those basic beliefs are democracy. If you talk to any American, you'll find out that most Americans really like democracy. And they like democracy because democracy provides us an opportunity to actually influence the government. And we can do that through the voting process. We can actually run for office. We can participate in political parties. We can participate in action groups, all of that. So most Americans believe and agree on the concept of democracy. Patriotism, love for the country. Most Americans will say, I don't want to live anywhere else other than the U.S. Because as we look at other countries and we compare their political system to our political system, what we discover is that we have a lot more freedoms and rights here than in any other place. So, when we look at the political culture of African Americans, what we are doing now are taking out African Americans and we're separating them and putting them into their own group. So now we're going to look at what is the political culture of African Americans. And so now we're looking at what is referred to as a political subculture. So we're looking at the political subculture in terms of African Americans. And you have political subcultures for Hispanics or Latinos. You have political subcultures for Caucasian Americans. But we're going to look at the political subculture for African Americans. And because of the way we are socialized, and then because of the culture that exists within our own group, that heavily influences what we think about politics, what we think the role of government should actually be. Now, let's go back to your textbook. Your textbook states that the political subcultures of African Americans is heavily influenced by history. Primarily, it is heavily influenced by slavery. And because of slavery, African Americans view themselves as an oppressed group. Now think about this. Let's just take a moment and think about what I just said. The culture, not just the political culture, but the culture of African Americans is heavily influenced by their history, our history. And that history for African Americans, it always traces back to slavery. And part of that history is that we've been an oppressed group and we continue to be an oppressed group. And so when we look at politics and government, we look at it as we're still fighting to be part of the system. But let's take a moment and think about the African American experience actually in the U.S. Remember that African Americans were brought by boat to the U.S. They were taken as prisoners, crossed the ocean, came to the U.S., and they were stripped of their identity. They couldn't even use their African names. They couldn't practice their African traditions. They were stripped of everything. So they were stripped of their culture. So what African Americans had to do as slaves was actually develop a new culture in the U.S. And that new culture helps to explain our culture today. Slavery is a big part of the African American experience. And because of that, it heavily influenced what we think about government. It heavily influenced what we think about what the role of government should be, how government should actually operate. It influences our ideas about justice. All of that as a result of slavery. So, with that in mind, let's look at what your book describes as elements of Black political culture. In your textbook, it outlines 3 elements of the Black culture. It outlines Black community, the importance of religion. It talks about alienation within our own culture. And then one that the book did not mention, but it really kind of said it indirectly, was the lack of trust that African Americans have in Caucasian Americans. So let's look at these one at a time. Black community. When you think of the Black community, this is where you are making generalizations about the entire community. When most people that are not part of the African American community think about the African American community, they think in terms of negative things. They think in terms of single parent households, absent dads. They think in terms of illegal drugs, all of those negative things. But in the Black community, we're not thinking about that. The Black community, we stick together and we understand one another regardless of where you were born. If you lived in Detroit, Michigan all your life, or if you lived in Hope, Arkansas all your life, where I'm from, we share a common community. We understand what it means to be Black. We identify with certain things. Regardless of where we were born, regardless of where we live, we still consider ourselves part of a community. Which leads us to the second element of the Black culture. When we look at the Black culture, religion is a big part of the African American culture. Why is religion so big? If we go back to slavery and we think about how religion was used by the slave owners used religion as a way to suppress the slaves, to make the slaves feel like they were supposed to be slaves, that this was their life and this is what they were supposed to do. They were created for this purpose. When the Black slave the minister would talk to the slaves on Sunday and they would have service, the slave owner or the overseer would be there to make sure that the message that was delivered was a message that the slaves understood, that they needed to stay in their place, that they were slaves, that they were supposed to be a slave. All of this was used. So religion was used by the slave owner to keep the slave in line. But religion was also used by the Black community as a way for freedom. Religious songs were used to communicate to slaves. They were able to communicate to one another through the wordings in songs. The Underground Railroad heavily relied upon religion as part of a way to communicate, where do I need to go? What's a safe place? But religion has been a huge part, because religion has been a way for us to come together no matter what. And the thing that you'll notice about the Black community is that the religious experience for Black people is relatively the same. It doesn't matter, again, where you're born, where you've lived, what type of church you attend. When comedians talk about Black churches, all the Black people are like, yeah, that happened to me. Yes, I know that took place, because we have the same experience. When we go back and we look at the civil rights era and we think about it, who were the leaders in the civil rights era? If we think about Martin Luther King, again, religion. How did they get messages out during the civil rights era? They used the churches. They used and the minister was not just someone that went to church and would preach a sermon. They were actively involved in the community, and they were the most respected individuals in the Black community. They were the negotiators with the white community. So religion has always been a part of the Black culture. Now in election time, every Black person that attends a church can tell you, oh, Reverend is getting ready to preach that sermon about elections. And in that sermon, he's telling you what issues are important, what candidates you need to be looking at. He's not doing it directly, but he's inferring that, or she's inferring that through their sermon. Black churches was the community. You would go to the churches on Sunday. You would have dinner at the church after church was over with. That was the center of the Black community. So religion has played a heavy part in helping the Black community and being a big part of the Black culture. Now, we talk about the Black community, but we also have to talk about the third element that your textbook outlined was the interpersonal alienation within the Black community. And again, all of this goes back to slavery. During the times of slavery, what the owners of slaves would do is that they would distinguish between slaves based upon color. The lighter slave was able to work in the house. Why? Because they felt more comfortable with the lighter slave, light-complected slave working in the house, because usually they were really a descendant of the slave owner. And the darker slaves were considered the workers in the field. Now think about this. Unfortunately, that attitude still exists today. The slave owners taught us to distrust one another. And that was a way, too, for the slave owners to keep the slaves oppressed, divide and conquer. If we can keep them from unifying as a group, then that means that we will be able to keep them from moving forward. Because if we don't trust each other, and then we don't trust the white man, then that means that we'll never progress. So there are, and that, unfortunately, that attitude still exists within the Black culture. And then the other thing is that if we go back to slavery and we think about who these slave owners were, they were white. And so within the Black community, you are taught at a very early age, don't trust the white man, quote unquote. Don't take it personally. This is just part of the black culture. Don't take offense by any means. I'm just giving it to you the way it's seen in the black culture so that you can actually understand. But in the black culture, it's taught don't trust the white man. It's kind of like the police. Blacks don't trust the police because of the experiences that blacks have had with the police time and time again. Black men are taught at an early age to actually distrust the police and to be prepared to be profiled so that if something happens, this is the way that you are supposed to handle the situation if you're encountered by the police. And we not only do this for black men, but we also do this for black women. Again, all of this is part of the black culture because this is part of the black experience. So let's look at these elements one more time. You have the black community as a group. We see ourselves as a group. And although we see ourselves as a group, there is still distrust in that group that's rooted in practices from slavery. So we still alienate one another as a result. Religion, though, plays a huge part in helping to create the black community and keeping us together. Religion has heavily helped religious leaders. Religion has heavily helped us move forward as a group. And then last but not least, you can't trust the white man. And again, don't take offense to that. That's just part of the black culture. Why? Because if we go back to slavery times, who were the owners? They were white. They lied to the slaves. They made the slaves think that they were supposed to be slaves, that they couldn't do anything else, that all their thoughts were supposed to be thoughts that the slave owner put in their head. So you understand why there's a distrust of the white community by blacks. So those are the predominant elements in the black culture. So how did this actually influence our socialization process in terms of politics? Okay, so let's think about it. If we go back and we think about agents of political socialization, which are really the mechanisms in which our beliefs and values are transitioned from, then we're going to be looking at the culture as well. So, agents of political socialization, again, are the mechanisms by which we acquire our beliefs, values, and opinions about government. Agents of political socialization are constantly changing. And when we look at the agents of political socialization, they're the same in the black community as they are for any community. But then your textbook also shows that there are other agents that have been used over time that have been exclusive to the black community. So let's think about primary agent of political socialization. Everyone already knows this is the family. When we look at the family dynamics of the black community, one of the big things that tends to be a huge factor is the lack of male role models. So, is that a problem within the black community? Does that influence what you think about? Does that influence what you think about politics? Yes. The foundation of everything starts with the family. Whether that foundation is negative in what you learn or positive, it still starts with the family. And when we look at politics in terms of the black voter is taught from an early age that the party that you need to support is the Democratic Party. And the reason for that, if we go back and we look at the civil rights era during the 1960s in the U.S., the Democrats were the ones that embraced the black voter. Now, they may have embraced the black voter for a variety of different reasons, but they embraced the black voter, and they were the ones that created social programs to help improve the livelihood of African Americans. So, it's not unusual for most African Americans to identify as a Democrat rather than as a Republican or an independent. Why? Because history has shown us time and time again that the Democratic Party has created policies to help improve the life of African Americans. When we talk about desegregation, it took place under a Democratic presidential administration. It took place during a liberal Supreme Court. All of those decisions were being made and handed down by a liberal Supreme Court, meaning that they were very democratic in nature. So when we talk about the family, it's not unusual for the family to hand down to the African American child that the political party that you need to support is the Democratic Party. But we also see in the African American community a lot of blacks that are not registered to vote. We don't see as much participation in political activities. But now, if you notice, with the selection of Biden's vice presidential candidate, Harris, you see more activity among blacks. When President Obama was elected to office, you saw more activity, political activity among blacks. So family, primary agent of political socialization, usually the number one. The other, again, is the church. When we start talking about church, religion heavily influences. Churches will provide vans to get voters to the polls. Churches will also hold registration drives to get people registered to vote. Churches will canvass for political candidates. Black churches will allow political candidates to come in and speak. So, are churches heavily involved in the socialization process for African Americans? Yes, because it's a huge part of our political culture, a huge part of the black community. Education, or our school system. Are schools important when it comes to learning about voting? The problem for the African American student in our public school system is that we don't learn about the African American experience. And what we do learn about the African American experience only focus on a few people. For example, Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. They don't talk about people like Daisy Bates. We don't hear about Harry Belafonte. We don't hear about all of these other people that also had a huge impact in terms of the black community, because it's not taught in the school systems. And then when we start thinking about the school systems, when we think about inner cities, they are predominantly occupied or consist of African American students. Those school systems tend to be underfunded. Teachers tend to be overworked. The resources that they have in terms of textbooks are outdated. There's overcrowding in the public school system. Schools are dilapidated. Some schools don't have air conditioning or heating. So they don't get a quality education. And there's not a lot talked about the African American experience in terms of politics. So, do schools heavily influence what we think about politics? Yeah, for everyone. But for the African American voter, for the minority voter in general, we don't hear about those things. We don't have the African American history classes. We don't get to participate, and we don't get that part of the history. So actually, it doesn't help us in developing our political ideas. Then let's look at the media. When we look at African Americans in the media, the images that they portray of us are always of African Americans on welfare, African Americans that cannot articulate very well, they don't speak English very well. It's always something that's negative. We don't see positive images of African Americans in the media. And even when we start talking about the theater and movies, we don't see a lot of African American actors. We have some, but we still don't see a lot behind the scenes and in front of the cameras. In the African American community, the joke is there's one person in the movie that's black, and they'll probably get killed within the first few minutes of the movie. So next time you watch a movie and there's an African American in there, notice how soon the African American gets killed off. And that's a running joke within the African American community. The media does not present us in a positive light. So again, when we look at the media, it's like we don't see, when they show pictures of voters at the polls, we don't see people that look like us. And last but not least, another major element or agent of political socialization is political movements. When we start talking about political movements, now is probably a perfect example of how the African American community has come together in the United States, and they have begun to protest and demonstrate as a result of Black Lives Matter. African Americans are protesting about the police brutality, the constant police brutality and killing of African Americans. The idea in the U.S. is that everyone is supposed to be treated equally because the law is supposed to apply equally. Unfortunately, that's not the case because of the individuals that are responsible for applying the law. So when we look at Black Lives Matters movement, this is huge. Will it have an impact on how African Americans will vote? Yes. So it is one of those agents. It is a way that we acquire our beliefs and attitudes. When we start looking at major movements that have taken place within the Black community, those movements impact what we think and how we vote and how we look at institutions. Okay, so let's think about this again. Let's review this one more time. The agents of political socialization are the mechanisms that we use to acquire our beliefs about politics. Family, church, school, the media, and major political events like the demonstrations and protests with Black Lives Matter. These are all agents where to help us acquire our beliefs and our attitudes about politics. When we look at the family, African Americans have a low voter turnout. So that means that voting may not be encouraged within the African American family. When we look at churches, we know that churches are heavily involved in the recruitment of getting African Americans to get out and vote, to participate. We know that schools lack the resources that are needed so that African Americans can actually learn about great African American political leaders, things that will help inspire them to actually want to go out and vote and to participate. And then we have the media that depicts African Americans in a negative light. And then we have political movements like Black Lives Matter that actually help to encourage blacks to vote and to get out and run for office, because that's the way that changes can be made. Your book talks about one other element: music. Music has been a huge way for African Americans to express their discontent with government, with policies. Vietnam War, huge time. Tons of songs were created to protest the Vietnam War, to express how we felt about the Vietnam War. Because African Americans viewed the Vietnam War from a totally different perspective. How is it that as an African American, I am being required to go and fight for freedoms for another group of people that do not live in the U.S., for freedoms that I don't have in the U.S.? And music has been a way to express that. But again, if we go back and we look at slavery times, the time period of slavery, African Americans use songs as a way to uplift, a way to communicate, a way to express themselves. So this has always been the case. The only problem, and your book points this out as well, is that we really don't have any true studies that help to explain the process of political socialization for the African American. All we can do is make some basic generalizations, but we don't have any studies to show what is the impact of all of these agents over time on the African American voter. Do African American voters change their political party affiliation? Have they moved to being more independent? What are the factors that influence how they vote later in life? From 9 to 15, from 15 to 25, from 25 to 35, from 35 to 40, from 40 to 55. We have none of that information. So we still don't know a lot that we need to know. We can only find that information out from talking to other African Americans. So, Chapter 3, let's review this real quickly, talks about political culture and political socialization of African Americans. In order to understand how African Americans are politicalized, or they acquire their attitudes and beliefs about politics, we have to first look at the individual political culture of the African American and what elements in that culture actually help to influence what we think about politics. And those elements your book outlined as being the Black community, as being religion, as being the fact that this lack of trust among African Americans, and the fact that African Americans do not trust the white man. And again, don't take offense to that. That's just terminology so that you can understand how African Americans think and what they feel. And all of that's part of the Black culture, which heavily influences how those agents, the family, the church, the schools, the media, and major political events are used as a way for African Americans to learn about politics. So think about it. For the African American, we make up roughly about 14% of the population. But when we look at the incarceration rate of African Americans, 80% of the prisoners in jail tend to be African Americans. 80%. And then we make up 14% of the population. Why is this the case? I encourage you to take time out to interact with your classmates and to talk about your experience within the Black community. And for those of you that are not African Americans, I encourage you to talk to the African American students about their experience. What did they learn from their family about politics? What did they learn about governmental institutions? Because in the African American culture, we are very skeptical of all of those. Why? Because we have been an oppressed people. We came here as slaves and we were oppressed. And we are still fighting this day for rights that should be guaranteed and is guaranteed to all according to the Constitution. I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening. And I hope that you were able to get something from this conversation or this lecture. And if you want to know more, contact me. My office is located in the Humanities Building on the 3rd floor, 3056. I'm right next door to Professor Wright, and I have enjoyed my time with you.